Greetings, everyone. I'm Salvador Cordova. Welcome to the Evidence and Reasons for the Christian Faith video channel. It is a privilege to be here. I'm still waiting on Emory. I sent, in his defense, I sent him the announcement like 5 minutes just before this stream started. So that's probably on me that he may not be here. And possibly that, oh, there it is. He is. He's working on connecting, Sal. So this is also restream. He has had some computer issues, and I don't know how well this would connect. So greetings to Godzilla Freak. I see him in the stream, and also Andrew Kaufman. God bless you, gentlemen. So a little bit about the channel, and I don't know if there are any newcomers here, but we search for evidence and reasons for the Christian faith, and unlike perhaps some Christians that insist that God is obvious, I say that he's hidden, and that's not completely hidden. Not completely hidden. For example, people that have never heard the gospel, he's certainly hidden from them in the sense that they have never even heard of the Christian God. And so it's certainly not like it's so obvious as the air we breathe that the Christian God is real. So his people have a responsibility collectively to share the gospel, and that's how some people learn about our Lord and Savior. Emory is here. Emory, how are you doing?
I'm better now that I've managed to get in.
I wasn't sure that you'd be able to connect. I actually like the Restream interface better than StreamYard, but people have had some connection issues, and I was like, yeah, I may have messed up, and we'll just see and find out how bad this.
I don't run live streams. Maybe once I'm done with grad school, I'll get around to that. But I don't run live streams, so like I don't know what the interface is like on the back end. But I can tell you, it is a lot easier for me to log into StreamYard than it is Restream. Restream, it just every time we try to do this, it takes me 5 minutes to try and load up. So, but I'm here, so we're good to go.
Yes, I appreciate the feedback, and what we had. Sometimes I do pre-recorded shows, and it's been my experience. It's just sometimes there's a little bit more pain involved in getting all the video prepared, and granted that sometimes the quality of the content might be a little better because you can edit out mistakes and stuff, and but it is a little bit more workload, and having a live stream when there's a co-host, that does make it easier. That delivering monologues for an hour is not easy, and it's nice to have a co-host. So with that, I'd like to honor our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. It said, acknowledge him in all your ways, and I definitely want to do that as we open this. So we are going to talk about a nerd topic tonight, and I often think when I wrote an email to someone today and said that science to me is like Proverbs 14:4, where it says, the stable is clean where there are no oxen, but there's much strength in the ox. One of my favorite pastors, Jack Lash, from a church I had attended in Gainesville, said that was one of his favorite verses in the Old Testament. And the idea is that, well, if you don't have any oxen, you don't have to deal with their doo-doo. But if you have oxen, you can do a lot. Especially if you're farming, you can plow fields. That was a source of power, and that is a metaphor for a lot of things in life, where you got to deal with the doo-doo, but then better things happen when you're willing to engage things that are not so pleasant. So there are aspects of science that are not so pleasant, and so I'm prefacing all that for what we might be engaging in tonight in Nerds Go Clubbing. I will say that this is important in as much as that I think that as we learn more about the fact that evolution is failing as a is failing as a theory, and abiogenesis, for all practical purposes, except those who are deluded and corrupt and just so closed-minded, it has failed as an enterprise. I've seen the abiogenesis case go from like very promising, like say in the 50s, and then they started invoking the possibility of space aliens and then multiverses. And so it's gotten worse and worse. I've seen that trend, and I don't see any reason that trend is going to reverse, despite the claims of some people on the internet to the contrary. So, Emory, do you have anything on your heart you'd like to share? It takes a while for people to get alerted, so we can shoot the breeze just a little bit before we get down to business.
That's perfectly fine. I would just say that the fact that the space alien origin theory for DNA was proposed by one of the guys who discovered what the structure was should tell you an awful lot about how bankrupt their explanations are. Because he, if anybody, should have known what that was and what it would take to produce it, and he didn't see a naturalistic scenario.
Yes. So I'd like to acknowledge everyone here and some of those in the side chat, like Jeremy Martin, One Cow Stampede, Honesty Angel, Janet Duthridge, and earlier I saw Godzilla Freak, and of course Emory here. I am a molecular biophysics researcher or research assistant. I'm not quite at that tier that I feel even comfortable referring to myself as a scientist, although I was a scientist and engineer in the aerospace industry. In the biological industry, I'm reluctant to classify myself as that. And Emory, introduce yourself just for the people that may be viewing us through recording. I want to brag on you a little bit too. So you go ahead and introduce yourself.
So in other words, I should totally undersell myself here. Okay. So as Sal said, my name is Emory Moyna. I do the In His Image blog. I am a graduate student in biology, halfway home. Praise the Lord. But anyway, so halfway through a master's in biology. I am I have a severe case of science nerdism, which is why I hang out with Sal. And I have a very strong passion for both theology and science, so which puts me squarely into the creation science debate. So yeah, so that's me. If you want to check out my stuff, you can find me on YouTube, In His Image, also in hisimage.blog on, and In His Image on most of the major social medias, including the alternative ones. So
that's fabulous. And I do apologize. I wasn't that quite so organized tonight. Well, I'm almost never that organized. On our show last night, I did put a links to your blog. I just didn't put it in the video description. So I need to maybe develop a mental checklist. I want to acknowledge Janet Duthridge. God bless you. You've been a great encouragement to me during this time. Janet, you're quite an inspiration. I'm starting to get bits and pieces of your personal story, and I thank you for your perseverance. And Janet says she'll have to listen later. She wanted to express prayers for me during my mom's passing. And mom is asleep. The Christian word for Christians who have died is sleep. It's a sleep. Death is. It's not meant to be a euphemism when we say sleep. It is meant to convey that, as it says in Thessalonians, we are not to grieve like those who have no hope. Christians have hope. If a loved one who is a believer passes away. And thank you for the kind words, Janet. And logical, plausible, probable. I can't thank you enough for all that you're doing. It's an inspiration. And there's Cheryl. So if I miss someone that I've forgotten to name, please, your forbearance. And yes, there is a there are verses in the Bible that talk about paying your taxes, and I'm right with you there, especially because of the events for me. I was scrambling to get my mom's taxes done. Um, in addition to the heartaches, now I have the headaches because I had the power of attorney, and now I am the executor of her estate, and I have to take care of things. And it's like, yeah, but if you see why I may seem in a good mood. I think it's your all's prayers, because when I went through this with Dad 18 years ago, it took me years to recover. But that was the time I was learning about creation science and relearning the Christian faith. And I really feel that your prayers are lifting me up. This is not Sal's inner strength or anything. This is the peace that surpasses understanding that comes only from the Lord's Spirit. So, if you saw me on Friday, you'd know that I was a total wreck. And backstage last night, I was just breaking down in front of Emory and he was saying, "Sal, I don't think we're in condition to go through the show." I said, "Let's do it. Maybe we could pull enough together." And I felt very blessed. The show went on for 2 hours, and it was a blessing to me.
Yeah.
So tonight we're going to deal with the doo-doo. I do want to say, this is very provident. Emory, you have by the way, Emory is just a great student. He's a great example for me to be organized. He's not the sort of guy that procrastinates. I can't believe how on top of his homework he is and how dedicated. So, because I've been kind of a bad student through most of my academic career. So even though I have 5 degrees, don't think that it was easy for me, because it's not my personality. I'd be the kind to procrastinate right before class. And I'm not that I'll ever do this again, but I'm embarrassed to say, and I hope I don't get a ticket for this because it's been a long time, but sometimes I'd be trying to do homework in my car on the way to school. So
I can honestly say I've never done that. I have done homework like the class period before when my undergrad. I've done that. I have never tried to do that.
Okay, all right. So all the secrets come out now. I wanted to say this is very provident. You have 2 weeks that you before your next graduate school class begins. And
thereabouts, yes.
Yes. It just so happens one of the other co-hosts in kind of this channel's pool, people who volunteer their time, Dr. Sandy Pigeon and his wife are on vacation for 2 weeks. So this is turning out real well, because once you go back to school, he comes back in the area and we can work together. And so he does things in archaeology and other areas of apologetics. And so this is going to be fun working with Sandy, but he's on vacation now. He came, God bless him. He comforted me a lot during this time. He and I attended the same church, and then he and his wife came to my mother's funeral, and I was really, I got a recording of it. Now, normally the Catholics will not do that, but because of COVID-19, they are live streaming. In the process of live streaming, some of it gets recorded. The Catholic priest gave one of the most beautiful Protestant style homilies, or what we would call sermons. And he alluded to that verse in Thessalonians. It said, "We do not grieve as those who have no hope." Christians don't grieve. And yeah, I got to tell you, it hurts really bad and it's lonely in here. But suffering has meaning with regard to Mom not being here, because I know she's in a better place. Anyone who loves someone deeply, you're willing to suffer so that they can be in a better situation. And it's giving meaning. So with that, let's go deal with some doo-doo here. We're going to do RH Brady's paper, and I'm going to put it up on the screen. I did want to let me share this. I am working on. I am working on at least one book right now. Booklet. I'm not going to do anything as massive as some of these other um, projects. I'd like to make a booklet, maybe about 40 pages, on Cures for Doubting Thomas, but I may address issues like the question of the hidden God. And there is this book called The Presence of a Hidden God that I read parts of it because you can get, one can get free samples, and I didn't completely agree with everything in it. But the title, "The Presence of a Hidden God," is the words of Blaise Pascal. He said, "God is hidden, but there are traces of his presence." And so the study of creation science and intelligent design is to detect this. And I've often said one of the things that I believe why God is not as evident to our senses as, like, say, the air we breathe, is that in part that is how he winnows those who don't want anything to do with him versus those who are seeking him with all their heart and all their soul. And I looked up some verses today that God was encouraging people that if they seek him with all their heart, they will find him. And so he doesn't make the path completely easy, but it's not impossible. And so to that end, that's why to the extent we start to destroy evolutionary theory on theoretical and experimental grounds, and same for abiogenesis, the natural alternative is, if there's not a naturalistic answer, is one that's supernaturalistic. And that points to God. And I'll argue also even the Christian God. To that effect, I've been tentatively recruited, even though I've said I don't like to debate. If someone like James Coons will write to me, I'll say I'll go ahead and debate, because I want to at least say, I'm willing to face some of my critics, not all of them. On the internet, on the Reddit sub, I've blocked like 100 people. 100 people. I'm not going to debate 100 people and just deal with all the same questions over and over again. It's just not a good use of my time. But I will take someone who probably represents the side and has all their questions and criticisms. And I've been tentatively scheduled to debate James Downard. Not that I asked for it. Apparently he was asking for it. So that's just a heads up. Likely this coming Thursday, Rob Stadler and I will be giving a show on the debate that never was, because we were in the middle of negotiations on modern day debate to debate digital gnosis and James Fodor on the question of whether DNA is evidence for God. And when they heard that it was proposed that someone of Rob Stadler's caliber, who's a PhD from MIT and Harvard in biomedical engineering, and is a very respected scientist, and then me, that was be the first team, the other side backed out. So we decided that we'll go ahead and make what we might have presented in the debate will probably be a little bit more verbose and, no time constraints. What we might have presented in the debate on Thursday. And then we'll also try to just guess what the other side would say. And then we would provide our responses to their hypothetical rebuttals. So that should be a lot of fun. So, Emory, do you have the paper with you? And
I do. Yes, I do.
Oh my goodness! I told the audience you're really organized. This guy's on the
ball. Sal, you haven't seen my apartment.
Okay. Okay. So this. Let me introduce how I got this paper. Sometimes it's just serendipity and God's providence. But I was doing work on Fisher's theorem of natural selection. I got that's a long story, because I worked with Dr. Sanford. He and Dr. Bill Basner published in the Journal of Mathematical Biology, and it turns out that their paper on Fisher's fundamental theorem set records for that journal. by a large margin in terms of the number of downloads for an open access paper. It just blew away all the other. So many people were reading it. And there's been lots of follow-on work in the wake of that. And because of my mathematical background, Bill Basner specifically signaled me out and said, hey, I want, can you work with me on this? So I've been working with Dr. Basner. He had to ask permission of John Sanford so that I could be assigned to work for him. And that's great work. I've done work with Fisher's theorem and continued to work. And in the process, I said, John, Bill, this is like a really empty idea, natural selection. Am I not getting it? Is there something here that I'm missing? He said, oh, no. That was Bill's conclusion for sure. And, I kind of, John kind of was sympathetic to that. And then I started finding all these references by evolutionists themselves criticizing their theory, from all the way from Joe Felsenstein. He's probably the most respected living population geneticist, to other people like Lewontin. And then so I gave a presentation to a private group on my work on Fisher's theorem, which is mostly a pedagogical work. And I actually shared it on Logical Plausible Probables channel, a peer-reviewed article I wrote last year that got accepted by an ID-friendly journal. It's not a pro-ID journal. It's ID-friendly, the Blythe Institute. And that's when I started to find all these things and codify all the problems with natural selection. After I gave this presentation, in the audience was Dr. Paul Nelson at the Discovery Institute, who is a young Earth creationist like me, but he's very much more known for his work on intelligent design. And he said, Sal, you're absolutely right. You've independently found what some of the most you've independently concluded, like others have, what the leading population geneticists have concluded, that natural selection, and particularly the definition of fitness, is an empty concept. And he sent me 2 papers, and one of them is RH Brady. He said, you'll really like this one. And that's the paper we're going to study. So let me put this on the screen here. So I do a screen share. And after I introduce a little bit more, this is Oxford University Press, Society of Systematic Biologists. And just so we have some references. Let's see if I have it here. Systematic Zoology, Volume 28, Number 4, December 1979, pages 600, 621. I'm trying to get in the mode of doing citations, especially since I'll be debating James Downward, and his standard modus operandi is say, can you give me a reference? So I'm going to reference him to death. So just be aware, James, you're not going to be dealing with someone like some of your other opponents that don't give references. Heads up. I'm looking forward to that debate, and I would like to, I'm probably going to contact Logical, Plausible, Probable, because otherwise known as John Maddox. He has debated James Downward, and there's some really great clips that he has a collection of. So with that, Emory, take it away, sir. And whenever you feel like you want to pause and we could have a discussion. Before we go on, this is going to be maybe a 6-part series, because this is like a 20, 30 page document, and we're not going to.
Yeah, no way we cover this whole thing tonight. Yeah. No way we cover this whole thing tonight. And I'm not going to read the abstract because we read that last night. So go watch the stream from last night if you want the abstract. And just to kind of tag along with Sal, I actually came without the math, because Sal's the math guy. I'm not the math guy. I actually came to the same conclusion about fitness that Sal did, just by reading the literature about selection. And going, this makes no sense. This doesn't add up. This doesn't work. So well, let's go ahead and get into the paper here. Starting with paragraph number 1. The principle of natural selection has come under increasing attack in recent years for any number of assumed faults. In general, the conclusion of the majority of critics has been that the principle is unnecessary and unfruitful. The defenders have, of course, rejected both claims. The critics usually bring an impressive collection of criteria for a good scientific theory to bear on the problem, and the defenders reply in kind. The problems are quite difficult, and a number of pitfalls work for both sides, and an atmosphere of miscommunication seems to pervade the whole discussion. The ground is obviously not familiar terrain for either side. A discussion of this sort, is a sign of health, particularly if it serves to make us more self-conscious of the manner in which our thinking lays hold of empiric evidence. A clarification of this activity could profit any field of science, for there are questions here which simply have not been settled as yet. Much of the argumentation in this paper, therefore, could be applied to other notions of evolutionary theory or to theories from other sciences. Keep that in mind, by the way. Keep that sentence in mind. I do not mean to single out natural selection as the only theoretical area which might benefit from scrutiny. But scrutiny is already underway in this area, and to my understanding, the critics have uncovered a problem worth looking at if we can get it into focus. The specific complaints most often put forward with regard to natural selection are that it is tautological, or untestable, or both. For reference, a tautology is a way of saying the same thing twice in the same sentence. He'll get more into that here in just a second, but that's just a very brief layman's summary for you. I propose to make an examination of these criticisms and counter the arguments using the intent of the theorist as a criteria of judgment. This is a standard to which every researcher should readily assent. The fruitfulness of a theory must be, for the man selecting it, the fruitfulness for his intent, for the purpose to which the theory is to be applied. If a theory or research activity can be shown to fall short of its intended purpose, this would be a useful criticism, and one which the researcher could understand. I suspect that matters will be somewhat clarified by approaching them in this manner. If nothing else, the argument of my own discussion should be easier to follow. I shall begin by examining the troublesome concept of tautology with regard to causal explanation in general, since causal explanation is the intent of causal theory. The accusation of tautological reasoning has been repeated by various critics, and he lists some papers here, and will be a recurring problem for this discussion. It will be necessary, therefore, to formulate the concept in such a way that its effect on the theory will become apparent. So basically what he's going to do here, and I'm just going to pause here real quick and see if Sal has anything he wants to say, but what he's going to do here is he's going to explain what a tautology is. All right, he's going to explain how that ties into natural selection. Sal, you have anything you want to jump in before I talk about tautologies?
No, let's go forward, and maybe it'll come to us. Great, by the way, that you're reading. You're saving my voice. Thanks.
Oh, not a problem, Sal. Not a problem. The etymology of the term. Oh, sorry. The header is tautology and causal explanation. The etymology of the term would suggest that the Greek idea was, quote, to speak the same, some form of repetition. The Oxford English Dictionary agrees that this is the underlying notion in the various usages listed, and it is certainly thematic to the usage made of the term in modern logic. We will not require any more rigorous definition than that provided by the Greek etymology. However, the argument will be quite clear on this basis. It is obvious, for example, that it makes no sense to criticize Gertrude Stein's repetition, a rose is a rose is a rose, by an accusation of tautology, since in this case, the mere repetition is the whole point. Whereas the advertisement for the bingo game that invites all husbands and married men has misused the tongue. Side note, you couldn't get away with saying that in the population genetics literature anymore. Anyway, moving on. In the former case, the representation serves the author's intent. In the latter, it does not. Tautology in logic becomes a pejorative term by specifying a useless repetition. And this indeed what is wrong with the second example above. I think he missed a word there. This is indeed what is wrong. There we go. I just misread it. Never mind. But we need not build the pejorative sense into the term. The basic notion is one of repetition. Once a repetition is identified, it becomes a simple task to discover whether the repeat is contrary to the speaker's intention and therefore useless or unfruitful for his purpose. The usual purpose in empirical science of theoretical propositions is some sort of causal explanation. This because that. In other words, science is trying to figure out this thing happens because this other thing over here happened. Right? There's supposed to be a direct cause-effect analysis, or at least correlation. Such a proposition is necessarily synthetic. That is, the second half adds something new, something not already contained in the first half. The alternative is the analytic statement, husbands are married men, which repeats the first part in the second. Analytic statements are quite useful for the purposes of definition. A deafness is an impairment of the hearing, but only a synthetic construction can serve as a causal explanation. So basically what he's saying here is repetition is fine if you're using it as an explanation. Like, so, deafness, deafness is an impairment of hearing. Well, that's a repeat, right? You're repeating it, but you're explaining what you mean by the word deafness. But it does not provide a cause effect. So in other words, you could not say deafness is the cause of loss of hearing, because that would make no sense. That wouldn't explain anything. You're just repeating yourself.
If I could weigh in a little bit.
Sure.
In mathematics, tautologies are used all the time. It's actually very useful because when you can show two things are identical, sometimes if you're trying to do a mathematical proof, you can prove one side of the tautology and demonstrate the other is true.
Right.
So it is important. It's not saying that, in that case, the tautology serves your intent. So we're not saying that all tautologies are bad. In fact, you really need them in math. The way the tautologies are expressed in math, it's if and only if. If and only if. So
there's a lot of that in geometry.
Right. So a lot of times you'll have the left side of an equation and the right side of the equation. If you can solve one side of the equation, you solve the other side.
Right. Yep.
But that is the intent in mathematics. You want tautologies. That's very useful. It's not good for certain theories that you're trying to say, like they said, a causal explanation. And this is what I think distinguishes this paper, is that it's talking about whether the way it's stated actually serves your intent.
Yep. And he's going to get into more on this here in a second. So when the definition strategy is used with causal intent, language breaks down, and he uses the same example I just used, i.e., your deafness is caused by an impairment of your hearing. That's meaningless. Means only that your deafness is caused by your deafness. The intent to add something more than the fact of deafness is not carried through by the formulation. A scientific theory brings distinct elements into a dependent relationship. The thunder is caused by the lightning. Your deafness is caused by a torn eardrum. Right? As cause and effect are not the same, the two sides of a causal proposition cannot be identical. This is why this isn't math. A theory becomes empirical by reference to observation, and may be said to gain empirical content or empirical determination to the degree that this reference determines either what is stated or that statement is accepted. That is, to the degree that such empirical information is allowed to affect our position. Beliefs about the world that are not informed by experience remain metaphysical in nature. They may indeed be true, but they are without evidence. There's a little bit of bias there, but we'll overlook that because that's not the point of what we're talking about tonight. Since the purpose of our reference to experience is clearly the addition of new information, something we do not already know, the intention is again synthetic. We want to discover, for example, whether the proposed relations hold for the observed world, and the generation of testable predictions allows our observations to bear upon the question. Of course, this requirement can be frustrated. It is not difficult to formulate statements about the world which cannot be altered by reference to that world. If our theory had the form, for instance, of the German saying, if the cock crows from the manure pile, it will rain or it won't, empirical test would be precluded.
If I could interrupt, that's my favorite line in the whole paper.
You can't, and Brady's 100% right here. You can't test that statement because if the rooster goes up to the manure pile and he goes up and he crows and it rains, the statement is true. If it doesn't rain, the statement is true.
The statement is true. And you know what? Evolutionary biologists didn't like me using this and saying that describes the reasoning of evolutionary theory.
To a T. To a T. To a T. There's change? Oh, there's evolution. No change? Oh, there's evolution. I mean, that is literally evolutionary biology in a nutshell. Oh, my. That's fantastic. Anyway, Observation could add no new information to this form of statement, and the synthetic intention of the observation would be thereby defined. The form of the statement left no room for determination through experience. In other words, you couldn't test it. There was no empirical way to test that information. You couldn't test that statement because, well, no matter how you test it, it's going to be true. If that makes sense. So, an experiment or observational test is projected from the theorized dependent relation between cause and effect. The causal statement predicts if this, then that. In order to test this empirically, we require an identification of at least two observations, or two groups of observations, corresponding to the supposed causal parameters and the situation resulting, respectively, the this and that above. Any failure to distinguish the observation or set of observations belonging to the first part from that belonging to the second, any failure that is to provide observations which may be compared, precludes the possibility of testing by precluding the possibility of questioning. So the point of the satirical folk saying above is that since any and all empirical conditions conform to it, no empirical results could ever question it. Does that sound familiar to anyone? It should sound an awful lot like evolutionary biology.
Yes, and if we could be just a little bit careful here, we are not criticizing universal common ancestry in this paper. It is specifically natural selection. So I want to say, don't think that. I think this is going to be a slam dunk paper for natural selection, but it doesn't disprove universal common ancestry, which is the heart of evolutionary biology. But we're taking a big chunk. So I just want to make that distinction. What we're attacking here is the idea that natural selection is a good mechanism or explanation for how things evolved. It's a separate question whether things descended by common ancestry, because there are ID proponents like Michael Behe that nominally accept universal common ancestry but reject natural selection
as the mechanism, right? So what we're doing here now, I am making jokes about evolutionary theory because some of this stuff does sound an awful lot like evolutionary theory. But the point here is that natural selection as a mechanism does not have the power to do what the evolutionists wanted to do.
Exactly.
And
it's
that's
so
what we're
poorly
gonna get
stated.
to.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So moving on here. I'm trying to remember where I left off.
Well, we could just say the point of the satirical folk saying.
Yes. Because the conditions specified under that clause do not forbid anything, the statement fails to identify a set of observations distinct from other possibilities. It cannot be empirically determined because it was not theoretically determinate. If either side of the dependent relation fails to identify a distinct set of observations, the statement is not testable. Thus, the result above could also arise from an indistinct this clause. The obvious remark that if the right conditions occur, we will have a good harvest affirms only that there is a dependent relation, but does not specify what the consequent is dependent on, and the consequent being the harvest. So in other words, it doesn't say what conditions cause a good harvest. It just says, well, if we've got the right conditions. Well, what conditions? Well, I don't know, just if we have the right ones. Can't test that either. Right? A theory can gain empirical determination only through a formulation that is able to specify the observations to be compared. In other words, if we get so much rain, then we will have a good harvest. That would be something that would be testable. Just saying, well, if we have the right conditions, we will have a good harvest is not testable. Hopefully that's clear for everyone in the chat. Sal, I cannot see the chat because I've got this blown up on my full screen. So if somebody doesn't understand that, let me know.
Okay, hang on. Let me just look.
Sure.
I can't go through all the chat right now because we're on a roll here. Okay, so
right. Right. If anybody's not clear on anything,
I don't see anything.
Okay.
And if you tag evidence and reasons, I may miss it, but you'll have a higher probability of me seeing it. So I do want to make a side comment here, and sure. I'm having a lot of fun reading this because this is starting to clarify even some of my own thinking. If I ever have to criticize natural selection, they keep invoking it where they say it's the right conditions. I'm saying you're just assuming it is. you haven't actually proven or even identified with the right conditions. We have let the other side get away with saying natural selection has the right conditions to evolve this. And that's turning out not to be the case. So this is actually really good. Remember, this is written in 1979, prior to Behe's Darwin Devolves, because since that time, we've had a lot of experimental evidence that says, oh, we're having a really hard time finding the right conditions to evolve a significantly new gene.
Yep. So I'll move on here. The several frustrations of intention covered here all stem from a failure to add to our starting point information not already contained within it. The notion of explanation suggests that we must add something to the facts explained unless we are to suppose that the facts explain themselves. Empirical explanation suggests further that some element of the addition will be derived from experience. Thus, a theory fails its intention if it does not add information to the events explained, and a research program, which arises through our attempt to treat the theory empirically, falls short of its goal if it does not provide an addition that is empirically derived. So that's important. I think that's important, so let me break that down just a little bit. If you're proposing a hypothesis, he's using the word theory a little bit loosely here, but if you're proposing a hypothesis or a theory, if it does not add information to the events explained. So in other words, if it just says, well, this event is explained, if it doesn't tell you why, then it fails. Right? If it can't give you more information than you had when you proposed the theory. Right? And and building on that, if you build a research program on that, it will also fail if it does not provide an addition to what is empirically derived. So in other words, if it's not providing empirical conclusions, then it also fails. Okay, hopefully that's clear, because that is very important to understand, right? Now, moving on. If my assumptions about scientific intentions are shared by biologists, then I take it that for them, as myself, a successful scientific endeavor must meet the requirement of form outlined here, or it cannot carry through its purpose of explanation. Since it is my impression that these intentions are shared by the biological community, I will continue by examining the various formulations of natural selection in order to discover how well they meet these requirements. All right, so we've gotten through all the technical stuff. Now we get into the meat.
By the way, this may seem tedious, but I really like what he laid out, because some people don't even bother thinking about whether all these piles of literature in substantial amounts by very highly regarded researchers, they don't bother thinking if the basis of all this is just smoke and mirrors and a useless theory. and so that, I mean, I'm glad he was verbose on this. Paul Nelson picked out a really good paper for us.
Yep, no, I agree. Like, it is very rare for an evolutionist to actually go back and question the starting assumptions. They might question some of the stuff that builds on the starting assumptions, but they almost never question the starting assumptions. So it's very, very thankful that Brady went and did the work and actually went back and said, okay, does this logically even make sense? And that's essentially what he's asking here.
And this was refreshing because, again, both you and I were independently arriving at this. I got it from the math. I'm just like, these equations are garbage. I'm just like, they don't say anything. I mean, it dawned on me when I was working through all these differential equations. I was like, this is garbage.
And see, like, I didn't even work the math because I can't. But without even working the math, I'm just reading the papers and I'm reading the logic and I'm going, no, that doesn't work. That doesn't work. It can't work that way. And I assumed that I just didn't get it. Like, I assumed that I was just dense and wasn't getting it. But then I started reading around more and I'm going, wait a minute, I'm not the only one that's not getting this. Like, I wasn't even reading creationist papers because I'm like, I'm not going to read creationist papers. I'm just going to read what the evolutionists say because I want to understand their. Like, no, I'm not the only one that's thinking something's off here.
Yeah, and to be fair, it's not necessarily. I really do want to, not that far be it from me to defend evolutionary biologists, but I do also want to be fair and give them credit where credit is due. Some of them did not see it until 20, 30 years. They were deep into it.
Mm-hmm.
And it took them 20 or 30 years to realize this is vacuous. And the example of that is Richard Lewontin. So I do want to be fair. Some of these people will be diehards and then they'll turn around late in life, to their credit.
Mm-hmm.
But after 30 years of their life is invested on something that was useless. It took them that long to come to terms with it. This paper will mention Lewontin.
Yep. All right, so we'll move on here. The purpose of the theory. The following discussion will assume that the principle of natural selection is at least intended to provide a causal explanation for the origins of morphological diversity, adaptation, and when the principle is extended as far as Darwin proposed, speciation. It can therefore be equated with the Spencerian phrase, the survival of the fittest, as Darwin recognized in his later editions. I have called this principle by the term natural selection, but the expression often used by Mr. Herbert Spencer of the survival of the fittest is more accurate and sometimes equally convenient. Okay, that right there. Okay. We'll probably come back to that.
Well, I did like I mean, it's easy to forget this. We're not talking about, what we're not trying to prove is whether survival of the fittest is true. We're trying to find a causal explanation of the origins of morphological diversity, adaptation, and speciation. But I like the fact they said morphology. So how does a bacteria acquire eyes? How do fish acquire wings and become a bird? That's the real question, not whether the fittest survive. Can survival of the fittest explain the origin of eyes and ears and nervous systems from more primitive forms? And I wish, actually, in this paper, I wish he actually used some examples of that to just, so it's not so abstract, something a little bit more tangible. But
right. And we will try to jump in and provide some examples when we have opportunity, because this paper is a little thick. So we will try to jump in and make it a little less abstract.
Right. And just to give a little anticipation, what happened with me with the mathematics, I said, so how does this predict a bacteria will eventually evolve to a creature that has wings, eyes, and ears and a nervous system? I said, the math doesn't show it. And I couldn't believe how much mathematical literature there is in population genetics. And I said, after all that, I said, you could spend decades studying this and it doesn't answer the question you're really interested in, such as the evolution of things like eyes and ears, etc.
Yep, exactly. So yeah, it's so
the since I cut you off, I'll read the last sentence. Okay. The discussion will be limited to this use of the principle, since I believe it will be the most ubiquitous, and will examine how well or how badly it fulfills this purpose.
Yes. Now, the survival of the fittest state phrase itself is tautological, but it isn't meant to be a causal explanation. Because, how do we know what's fit? Well, the ones that survive. Well, how do we know this? Why do they survive? Because they're fit. Why do they fit? Because they survive. And you just go in circles. But it's not meant to be a causal explanation. It's just meant to be an offhand, hey, this is what happens. Right? So that's not meant to be an empirical explanation. So it is tautological, but it's also not meant to be empirical. So that, at least the way it's phrased by Darwin. But we're going to get into that as we go along here, because we'll get into this. So differential reproduction. This is what a lot of people are told natural selection is. When one observes a group of animals over time, it becomes obvious that reproductive differentials exist. It's true. From this information alone, one may theorize that allele frequencies within a gene pool can shift. It's also true.
Oh, can you briefly explain alleles?
Okay, yes. Okay, so, well, that's actually a lot more complicated, but I'll strip it down to the Mendelian idea of alleles. So an allele is basically something that codes for a particular trait. It could be an allele for hair color, it could be an allele for eye color, it could be an allele for, eye shape or skin tone or any number of different things, right? And so if you have a population of animals where you have some of them have black wool and some of them have gray wool, over time you can see shifts in how many have which color as the allele frequencies shift. Right? So hopefully that made sense to everybody in the chat.
Yes, eye color, skin color. And I would add, strictly speaking, and even the professionals don't stick to this, strictly speaking, it's the change in allele frequencies. But we often say someone inherited so-and-so's genes. What they really mean is the alleles. No one is that strict, but I just need to point that out. So when you hear the idea of alleles, just also kind of think of the colloquial use of genes.
Yep. So moving on. But this is not yet an adequate hypothesis for the origin of diversity. Notice he says the origin of diversity. Okay? That would be an adequate hypothesis for not the origin of diversity, but the spread of diversity or the population diversity. I'm trying to, it would be an adequate hypothesis for how the traits are spread in a population, but not where they come from. Does that make sense? Sal, am I making sense?
But this is not an adequate hypothesis for the origin of diversity. So I think we need to read on a little bit.
Okay, yeah, we'll read on a little bit and then we'll come back to this.
But differential survival of the fittest does argue for why a certain trait will be, over time, be more represented in a population.
Correct. Yes.
Like IQ, for example, which is kind of funny because over time, natural selection seems to be selecting less intelligent individuals.
Yes.
Anyway, we can go on.
There's a clip that you could play there, Sal. Anyway, maybe you edit that in the edits or something. But anyway, this is not yet an adequate hypothesis for the origin of diversity, since changes in allele frequency take place within stable populations. If we suppose, either accidentally or through the agency of some causal power, the changes accumulate in a direction, then we have a hypothesis. If even Darwin did not care to suggest that such a direction could arise without causal control, so he provided a form of control, i.e. selection. That is, he added the notion of selection to that of differential reproduction in order to generate an explanatory hypothesis. That's really, really important.
And actually, I needed to even pause because to digest that sentence was kind of like, he did. I mean, this is actually the first time someone has said it explicitly, and we might need to kind of think through what that one sentence means.
Yeah, I think we probably should stop here and just try to unpack it.
Yeah.
Because that is huge. I don't think unless you're as immersed in this as Sal and I am, or I'm not even sure how to say that, as Sal and I am, or whatever. Unless you're a nerd, let's put it that way. Unless you're a nerd, you aren't probably going to realize just how big that is. And let me just kind of try to unpack why that is. He has just said that differential reproduction is not the definition of selection. I repeat that. Differential reproduction is not the definition of selection. Selection is a causal agent that is added to differential reproduction, which we know happens. Okay? But you can't use differential reproduction to define natural selection, because selection is a form of causal control, a cause that is put behind a mechanism that we know happens, differential reproduction, to explain a direction of trait change in a population. Have I explained that correctly, Sal?
Let me add this.
Go ahead.
It's been my unfortunate experience that evolutionary literature is generally confused. You will not get a straight answer from. You talk to one set of people, they'll define it one way, and another set will define it other way. Or if it's not a formal definition, you can tell they have different meanings. So, like when, because of my work on the mathematical population genetics, they define selection as they actually equate the two. Joe Felsenstein is one of the leading population geneticist. He says selection. We measure selection in terms of its variant as a deviation from the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Okay, I know that sounds really packed, but it's like, okay, you're not. This is like trying to grab a cloud. How you grab it, it just morphs into something else. And so, for those who are suffering through this reading, if it sounds a little bit confused and not in agreement with the way you've heard things, that's the way it really is, and that's unfortunately being used to good effect by the evolutionary community. They want to give the appearance that you just need to study this more, and then you'll understand. And the reason you're failing to criticize it is you don't understand. But then the more you actually study it, you realize the whole field is confused. So this is the first time I encountered this particular characterization. So I'm not going to say that's right or wrong because no one agrees. I've seen evolutionary biologists in their literature disagree on what fitness and selection really is. So maybe take it with a slight grain of salt. This may be unique to RH Brady that he's characterizing it this way. So, but
right, and I want to be fair. I want to be fair to Brady.
Yeah,
I want to be fair to Brady. This is just Brady's opinion. This is not necessarily the opinion of every evolutionary biologist out there. Okay, but Brady making that claim is a big deal because that's really a strong departure from evolutionary biology of the past. It's different and really kind of shoots them in the foot, if we're being perfectly honest, compared to how a lot of evolutionary biologists like to argue. And that's why I stopped on it, because it is a big deal. It is a big deal that Brady was one.
And I need to point this out. And just like it's taking the community so long to figure out that they don't understand their own claims, because I in my work on Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection, it came out that these guys said we don't even understand what fitness is. I'm just like, it's taking you that long to figure that you don't understand what it is. And then it also tied into what the definition of selection. Because the idea of fitness and selection they're deeply related, and so anyway, let's just go on, because I think
we'll move on. But that was
clarity. I think the goal is not to really figure out what Darwin meant or not. Mm-hmm. The goal is to find out if we have a workable theory.
Right.
Okay. So we'll just go on.
Right. And that is, he added the notion of selection to that of differential reproduction in order to generate an explanatory hypothesis. Of course, were selection to be subtracted again, we will be left with the fact of differential reproduction. No explanation of this effect can be derived from the effect itself, and thus no way to explain, much less predict a direction from the differential. All right, so again, basically what he's saying is, hey, we know differential reproduction happens, but if we subtract selection, we don't have a mechanism to point which direction it's going to go. Right? Since tautology is fatal for any sort of causal explanation, it is somewhat mysterious to find a number of authors advancing an admittedly tautologous formation of natural selection. Waddington, for example, published the following passage in 1960. Quote, "Natural selection, which was at first considered as though it were a hypothesis that was in need of experimental or observational confirmation, turns out on closer inspection to be a tautology, a statement of an inevitable, although previously unrecognized relation. It states that the fittest individuals in a population, defined as those which leave the most offspring, will leave the most offspring."
I'm sorry.
I can't believe he wrote that.
Thank you, Captain Obvious.
Yes, thank you, Waddington, for writing that. And by the way, I think Brady's struggling to believe that Waddington wrote that.
You know, I'm sorry I don't have I need to Google quickly and get a picture of Captain Obvious. I'm going to just flash the picture on the screen.
Anyway, I can't believe Waddington wrote that. And I think Brady struggles with that passage too. He goes on. Once the statement is made, its truth is apparent. This in no way reduces the magnitude of Darwin's achievement. Only after it was clearly formulated could biologists realize the enormous power of the principle as a weapon of explanation.
Talking about
wait,
two sides of your mouth there, buddy.
He went from natural selection as a tautology to natural selection as an explanation in 2 sentences. And this is why I say evolutionary biology is a vacuous, empty theory. Because they do this. And admittedly, Brady's calling him out for it. Like, Brady is calling him out because Brady knows this is bad argumentation. He knows that. Now, going on.
And here you go.
Yeah. Macbeth,
I just had to. Okay.
Go ahead. What?
I had to show a picture of Captain Obvious there.
Sorry, I can't see the screen, Sal. I've got this blown up. So. Oh my. And again, guys, like those of you who are evolutionary biologists like Dr. Dan and whoever else that might watch this, we're not making fun of you unless you believe what Waddington believes, in which case, yes, we are. Because that's ridiculous. That is ridiculous. Anyway, so am I good to go on, Sal?
Oh, go on.
Okay. Macbeth, 1971, found this passage, quote, staggering. It's even more astonishing to reflect that Macbeth's reaction was not a common one. In other words, everybody else read it and went, oh, no big deal.
And Macbeth is a lawyer, but he had a very piercing mind, and he had to fight for respect. And that's been the case. Sometimes the outsider just, say the emperor has no clothes.
Philip Johnson comes to mind. He was a lawyer
another
as well.
attorney. Yep.
A very
this is kind of mean to say, but the lawyers should be pretty keen to catch BS because they can make some of it themselves. So I'm sorry to say that.
Of it themselves, so they should know what it looks like. Sorry, any lawyers out there.
Yeah, apologies. Yeah. Sincere.
Anyways, the passage above defines fitness as leaving the most offspring. It then states that the fittest individuals will leave the most offspring and calls this statement a weapon of explanation. Again, mind-boggling. It is, to begin with, extremely difficult to believe Waddington's claim that the idea that individuals who leave the most offspring do, in fact, leave the most offspring was, at any time, an unrecognized relation.
Exactly. Thank you, Captain Obvious.
Yeah, flash it back up on the screen, Sal.
All righty, here. Okay, I'll put. Hang on, I just lost Captain Obvious for a second. Here we go. Thank you, Captain Obvious. All righty. Yes, yeah, I agree. How could he say that was an unrecognized relation?
No clue. Literally no clue. But it is very clear that biologists might be slow in recognizing the explanatory power of this formulation. If in fact deafness is to be explained, how does it help to suggest an impairment of hearing? If differential reproduction is to be explained, what light is shed by pointing to differential reproduction? I suspect that Brady was being slightly sarcastic here. And I can't blame him. Anyway, we already know that some individuals leave more offspring. What we want to know is why. In particular, we should like to discover some trait or traits independent of leaving more offspring that explain why one individual is more, quote, fit, i.e. more likely than others to leave a greater number of offspring. Since the tautologist formulation does not produce any criteria of fitness other than the fact to be explained, differential reproduction, it amounts to the claim that the facts explain themselves. Individuals leave more offspring because they leave more offspring.
And let me weigh in on here. And this is what kind of horrified me about population genetic literature. Okay, so it really is. I mean, there's some cases where we could say a creature that has the ability to see will have more offspring than those that are blind in many environments. But then we do see the reverse. There are environments where blind cavefish will out-reproduce the fish with eyes because it's metabolically expensive. It takes a lot of nourishment and energy, and it causes problems. I mean, if a creature is using a lot of their nutrition and their body resources to maintain eyes that they don't use, the ones that lack eyes and don't expend all that energy outcompete. So there are cases of that. We also have things like wingless beetles or whatever. We have many examples where it depends on the environment. So where was I headed with this? Well, I was slugging through these painful graduate level population genetic equations, and I'm like, there's nothing here that says one trait's going to be superior to another in a certain environment. You have to specify the environment and the trait. But there's nothing in survival of the fittest that says what the environment will be or what the trait will be. And I said, that's all lost on there. And so it's like, well, having eyes is more fit. It's like, well, that depends on what environment you're in. Or having wings is more fit.
Yep. And we see things like insular dwarfism, for example. Like it might be advantageous to be smaller on an island, or maybe it's advantageous to be bigger on the mainland, but you're not really changing that much. You're just, the situation changed. It's all situational.
And if I may just throw this out for the creationist, people were reluctant to say this, but we're getting dumber and dumber. And Emory was referring to a clip, or one of our detractors, I caught him saying, yeah, it could well be we're getting dumber and dumber and we'll lose our mind. And that's how the human race will be saved. And I was just laughing. I said, see, you've essentially identified one of the problems with natural selection. Because the population geneticists are saying, this is kind of disturbing. Our genome is actually being degraded by natural selection now, as far as intelligence goes. Now, since there are references to this, but I mean, you can kind of see it that a woman who's extremely intelligent might end up becoming a scholar and a professor, and during her childbearing years, she may be in school. Not to mention that a woman of higher social standing usually will be a lot more finicky as far as mates. That's just the way, for whatever reason, that's how it goes. She will not accept someone of a lower social standing in general. She's not going to go for a gas station attendant or a waiter.
Generally speaking, no. Yep.
Yeah. So this is raising some interesting issues. I mean, that's just, intelligence is one thing that got me, but going back to what we're talking about here with Brady, is that survival of the fittest doesn't describe any of this. It's just assumed, and it doesn't explain. So, how does they build all these population genetic equations? And I could say, okay, it could just as well argue that we're deteriorating genetically as increasing genetically in terms of functionality. All of that it's like natural selection hasn't explained anything.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I mean, and to be fair, I'll just kind of give a little, I guess, spoiler / sneak peek here. Natural selection can sort of explain one thing: the conservation of the genome, so that it basically doesn't fall apart from mutations, because it gets rid of the absolute worst. That's what it can see, but it can't really explain too much else. And so let's go ahead and jump a little bit further on down the.
Okay, so I guess, sorry to cut you off. So how about we start with the sentence? I'll read the last the
No,
sentence.
I got it. I actually think I remember where I was.
Oh, contrary to Waddington's claim?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Contrary to Waddington's claim, the tautological repetition is utterly useless for explanatory purposes. How about that? How about that? Shocking. Anyway, all very obvious, or so one would think. But J.B.S. Haldane did not think so. Quote, the phrase survival of the fittest is something of a tautology. So are most mathematical theorems. There is no harm in stating the same truth in two different ways. I think that's from a paper in 1935. Yes and no, because math and natural selection are not the same thing. But that's what he's going to get into that. Brady is going to get into that. So I'm not going to go down that road. I single out Waddington and Haldane from the crowd of biologists who say or imply the same thing, only because they put the fallacy in such exemplary terms. Ouch.
You're saying, what a great discovery, and it's utterly useless.
Yes, what a great discovery, and it's utterly useless. Anyway, so Haldane here puts forward the most popular defense of the tautology. After all, mathematics is tautological. Well, yes, it is. But mathematical theorems follow from axioms by definition. Mathematical truths are analytical in nature. Causal explanation is synthetic. How Haldane missed the difference is hard to understand, but he was clearly oblivious of it when he wrote the passage above.
If I may pause here.
Go ahead.
This is where I actually wouldn't mind spending a little more time with Danny the philosopher, because I'm actually not familiar with, there's a distinction between, what was it, analytic versus synthetic. And he's an analytic philosopher, and I don't know if that has any significance. So there's something called mathematical truths are analytic, causal explanations are synthetic. I've not really, okay.
I'm not entirely sure. Like that one's the one that's a little bit beyond me. I'm not a philosopher. Where's Danny when you need him?
Yeah. So if the readers are not familiar with that language, neither am I. And I've been in science a long time. I've never heard that distinction, and I've studied math and science. They don't use, this is philosophical language. It's interesting, and I think it'd be useful. So causal explanation is synthetic. Okay, go on.
Yeah. So again, I'm not an expert in this field either. So again, Danny, if you want to leave a comment when you watch this, feel free to educate us. I've been belaboring a simple point because I want to be well rid of it. Differential reproduction, or even differential mortality, which is closer to the original idea, has no explanatory power, but remains a datum to be explained. And by the way, datum is singular for data. If natural selection means anything in a causal framework, it means that a causal factor exists, independent of differential reproduction or mortality, the discovery of which could explain the differential. It is to this formulation and this research program we must now pass. All right, so let me explain what he means there. What he means is that just saying differential reproduction exists is not explanatory. Instead, it needs to be explained. Why does differential reproduction exist? And if you're going to appeal to selection to explain it, then you can't define selection as differential reproduction.
Which is what the population geneticists have effectively been doing.
Mm-hmm.
Until some of them realized, oh my goodness, we're doing that. That's not a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that seems to be the model of evolutionary biology is let's just define selection as differential reproduction and then say we've explained differential reproduction by natural selection. It's all smoke and mirrors. It really is.
I mean, it is a little horrifying because these guys are tenured and they have, I mean, their math is impressive. I'm not going to, I mean, if they were just pure mathematicians, I think they'd be, I mean, mathematicians are sometimes offended that their math has any utility in the world because it seems denigrating. No, seriously, I've been around enough of them. They want something so pure that it doesn't describe anything in everyday reality. And it's just funny, their attitude, but as impressive as it is, it's so decoupled. I mean, I can say that, but if you've seen as much population genetic literature in the mathematical side of it as I have, you're just like, this is so decoupled from reality. I'm just like, what does this have to do with anything? I mean,
Yeah.
You can impress girls at the salad bar with it, maybe that you're so smart and you can do the math, but it really doesn't describe reality.
Yeah. And that's true. That's true in a lot of sense. That's very true. So let's move on to the subsection entitled "The Hand of Nature."
It means causal factor exists independent of different, the discovery of which could explain the differential. It is to this formulation and its research program that we must now pass. Okay, I'm sorry. Go on, Emory.
All right. So the hand of nature, and he starts off with a large quote here. We cannot suppose that all the breeds were suddenly produced as perfect and as useful as we now see them. Indeed, in several cases, we know that this has not been the case of their history. The key is man's power of accumulative selection. Nature gives successive variations, man adds them up in certain directions useful to him. In this sense, he may be said to make for himself useful breeds. Owing to this struggle for life, any variation, however slight, and from whatever cause proceeding, if it be in any degree profitable to an individual of any species, in its infinitely complex relations to other organic beings and to external nature, will tend to the preservation of that individual and will generally be inherited by its offspring. The offspring also will thus have a better chance of surviving, and of the many individuals of any species which are periodically born, but a small number can survive. I have called this principle, by which each slight variation, if useful, is preserved, by the term natural selection, in order to mark its relation to man's power of selection. And that is a quote from Darwin. Darwin's original intent was clearly to designate a causal agency that was analogous to the hand of man. The natural environment was a master breeder, far more attentive and meticulous than a human breeder could ever hope to be. We see the results of this process, Darwin claimed, in a close adaptation between modern species and their habitats. Species are fitted to their particular niches as if they were bred to them, as in a sense they were. In this formulation, natural selection hypothesizes a determinate relation between specific traits and the environment. Such a hypothesis could give rise to useful research, for obviously these relations remain to be demonstrated. Why then did anyone think of turning away from the search for such relations to the empty formula of differential reproduction? Because it would seem the search for causal relation is fraught with extreme difficulty. Darwin had already hinted at the problem. How can we investigate infinitely complex relations, which presumably exist between an organism and its environment? Darwin repeats the adjective many times in many contexts. The vocation cannot be written off as a habit of speech rather than thought, because Darwin clearly sees the concept of infinite steps and complexity as strengthening his argument. No idea why. The greater the complexity of relationship, the greater the power of natural selection, which acts through all relations at once. But a summing up of an unknown number of parameters can be very difficult to investigate. A perusal of the origin does not raise hopeful prospects of research. Does Darwin suppose that we can perceive the causal connections he hypothesizes? Only with great difficulty. Quote from Darwin. Man can act only on external and visible characters. Nature cares nothing for appearances except insofar as they might be useful to any being. She can act on every internal organ, on every shade of constitutional difference, on the whole machinery of life. Under nature, the slightest differences in structure or constitution may well turn the nicely balanced scale in the struggle for life and so be preserved. Can we wonder then that nature's productions should seem to be far truer, quote, in characters than man's productions? That they should be infinitely better adapted to the most complex situations of life and should plainly bear the stamp of far higher workmanship? Well, he's right about that. They do have a stamp of far higher workmanship than man. It's just not a natural one.
Yes, and actually, this is there are so many things in this that would be part of a much larger discussion, because what we found out to our, and again, I'm going to go back to that thing about intelligence declining in humans. We're seeing natural selection not accumulating what we would consider complex traits. And Darwin thought that the complexity is always selected for. We're finding that not to be true. We are seeing that natural selection actually either impedes the growth of more complex systems or selects for their degradation. That is only being finally acknowledged after like 150, 160 years that it's not working as
That's not that long.
advertised. So we actually have empirical evidence now to the contrary of the way he actually saw this. So
Right.
she
So
can act on every
good
internal organ or every shade of constitutional differences on the whole machinery of life. Okay, we can.
Can I take a slice at that?
Oh, please, by all means.
That is utter malarkey. Natural selection cannot see internal organs unless they are causing a problem for the main phenotype. Natural selection can't see genes. Natural selection can't see point mutations. It can't see any of that. All natural selection sees is the phenotype, which is basically what the animal is. The whole, it's the collective whole. So if there's a real small mutation, guess what? Darwinian natural selection, any other form of natural selection, blind to it, can't see it. This is why, by the way, recessive traits that are negative don't just get flat wiped out because they're hidden by dominant traits.
Yeah.
Selection can't see
So
them.
I just want to, just because I know how your critics might be, they'll say, oh, look what Emory said. He's not saying that it may or may not have an effect because certain point mutations can be deadly.
Oh, no, obvious. No, that's not the point at all.
Okay. So I'm giving you a chance to clarify.
So yeah, thank you. So my point is not to say that no point mutation can be seen by selection. But if you change one letter and it's a neutral mutation, selection can't see it. If it's a slightly positive mutation, selection can't see it. It's in the no selection zone. You want to read, you can read some papers from the population geneticists on this. There is a no selection zone, and it's right around the neutral line. So like natural selection is very, it's groping around in the dark. It can find the big stuff. It just can't find the small stuff.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you for clarifying. I'm just trying to protect you from your critics quoting you out of context there.
Sal, they're going to do it anyway, but thank you. So moving on from Darwin. He supposed, and he being Darwin, at least that there were far too many parameters for him to pin anything down in his own text. The research program would follow. Has it followed? It's obvious that much effort has gone into the task, but that's not what I mean. Darwin succeeded in proposing a theory that had on logical grounds the form of causal theory. It was synthetic. It attached cause to effect. It postulated a determinate relation between animal traits and the environment, and it initiated a search for these relations. But a successful theory must generate a research program that is possible to carry out. The Darwinian program must somehow unravel a causal nexus of unknown, quote, infinite parameters and resume them conceptually. The attempts to perform this task do not always evidence a full awareness of the difficulties involved. So basically, what he's saying here is that the Darwinian research program is much more difficult than a lot of people realize.
Now, I want to just point out here, we're one quarter through the paper. Mm-hmm. And we're going on 1 hour and 20 minutes. And I think I'm going to, just for the sake of the readers, the viewers.
Yeah, this next section is quite long, Sal, so we're probably better off stopping it.
Yeah. And it's almost kind of unfortunate that it's a little bit kind of, I think it's a little unfortunate that we do have to stop. But this is, again, dealing with the doo-doo. You can't dig through it all at once. But this is giving the flavor of what scientific thinking and research would involve. So it's been an hour, 20 minutes. So this could be, if we were thinking and reading this would be a 4 or 5 hour task to do this. Oh, by the way, that's why it's called Nerds Go Clubbing. Just for those who are not aware, it's traditional in the scientific community for informal groups to gather together among researchers, and they call it journal club. or they'll just come together as a club and then they'll just read various papers together. So that's the way the nerds go clubbing. Clubbing usually refers to night clubbing, but I'm just showing the nerd thing.
This
So
is
would
our
be,
version of it.
yeah, this would normally be a 5-hour thing, but
because there'd be more people in the room, and when there's more people in the room, guess what's going to happen? There's going to be more people objecting to stuff or asking questions about stuff. If you've got a room full of 10 people trying to read this paper, you probably wouldn't get through it in a night.
Yeah, definitely not. This will give people things to think about. I'm just going to say, because my specialty is in protein research, you can't take the equations of population genetics, all that math. I mean, piles of math, decades, 40, 50 years of mathematics and developing differential reproductive success. You can't tell whether they're unable to specify what environment is going to evolve such and such protein. And that's when my eyes started to be open. I said, you spent 50 years developing a theory. You can't explain the origin of this or that. And we're talking a single enzyme sometimes. We're not talking about a complex trait like an eye that has quite a bundle of proteins and regulatory mechanism, et cetera, et cetera. We're just talking about a single enzyme. They cannot, they're talking about all the infinite, I think he was saying the parameters of the environment and how that will lead to, that's the real question. What will lead to differential reproductive success that will create that protein?
Yeah, that's the question they're trying to answer is what causes differential reproduction? We know it exists, so why?
Why? And there is a subtle thing here. They're assuming there's a subtle assumption that it was differential reproductive success that caused all these little changes to accumulate to make, say, a new protein. There's an inherent circularity there. They've already assumed that the environment has done this, and they never bother to ask, is that really true? Can the environment do this? Because what we're finding now, however you may state the idea of genetic entropy or genetic deterioration or what they call devolution or reductive evolution, what we're finding kind of rather disturbingly is that organisms are losing genes. They're either being disabled or they're disappearing from the genome in whatever way, and in ways that you wouldn't expect them to be recovered. So it's like, well, how did they originate? Because if that's the environment, if most of the observations are for complexity loss and gene loss, where there's more loss than, say, the emergence of new genes, how can there be a net accumulation going from, like, say, a bacterium to a eukaryote to multicellular organisms? If everything we observe is the opposite, and that's how natural selection works. But it's only now, like 2021, it's becoming really brutally apparent. Whereas I think around the time of Darwin and shortly thereafter, and they were thinking it's such a great theory, no one bothered to ask. And the myth has been perpetuated. I'm just kind of saying this also just to try to keep the paper interesting, because it could actually become laborious. This is great because this is a 1979 paper. It anticipated everything we're finding in terms of problems.
Yep. Well, I mean, a lot of the problems with natural selection have been known in the population genetics community for a while now.
Long time.
And they just kind of kept it to themselves and didn't really talk about it.
Yeah, you'll find they could plausible deniability. They said, well, we did write this little paragraph here, kind of, there, but then the population, the pop science journals, not journals, the popular science writers, for the newspapers and magazines will keep hyping up these discoveries that get, like Tiktaalik or whatever, just giving the impression that all of this has been solved. And then really a lot of biologists I met don't really do population genetics because it's so math intensive. A protein biologist normally will not study population genetics. He'll study the proteins. He's not caring about all that.
Right. He doesn't care.
And the other thing is the phylogeneticists.
Oh, please.
They don't, only if they don't consult traditional population genetics. They will consult a population geneticist. Like Felsenstein does population genetics and phylogenetics. But these guys that are just building trees, they don't care about any of this. They don't care about, the definition of fitness and whether it really works or natural selection really works. They just assume it. So one group of biologists that are promoting evolutionary theory doesn't even talk to the other group. They're all disconnected.
Right. Yeah, and that's a challenge that just goes on across science. Like the fields tend to be very disconnected from one another.
Yeah. And actually, if they were better connected, I think the theory would actually fall apart because they'd start to see it.
I'm not so sure about that because I think it's a religious thing, but I think you'd see more dissidence.
Right. On scientific grounds, it would fall apart, not on the religious grounds. It's going to be perpetuated on religious grounds because just like abiogenesis, they've totally failed on theory and experiment. It's only perpetuated by just religious belief.
Right. Yep. And like I think you would see more dissidence. I don't think it would ever stop being the dominant dogma until they can replace it with another purely secular dogma, which I don't know where you'd come up with.
Yes.
But I think you would see a lot more dissidence coming out. I think you'd see a lot of people coming out and going, "Hey guys, this ain't quite right." I think you'd see more behees. I think you'd see more people attached to the ID movement than you do now if there was more interaction between the groups.
Yeah, so we'll see where it all goes. Before we close the stream, if there are any last minute questions that you have for Emory or I, or any suggestions as to what we could be helpful for elaborating on. So like it was really good, for example, when Emory, I asked him to explain what an allele was, because for the uninitiated, it has its specialized language. Yep. So I'm just going to hold off for a minute or so and invite any questions or comments.
As Rob Carter says, this is stump the chump time. Find a way to stump the presenters. But no, seriously, if you have questions, feel free. And if you think of something later, my email's posted on the channel. Feel free to grab it on my channel and send me an email. I'm more than happy to respond to emails. I am a little bit slow about responding to emails, but I do respond to them. So feel free to any questions, comments, concerns, whatever. Feel free to drop those either in the chat or send me an email.
So I'll say something that I got in this paper now in this reading that I didn't get initially. The distinction between analytic and synthetic constructs. And I'm only becoming sensitive to that because of Danny, our philosopher friend. So while I'm waiting for any last minute questions, I'm going to look it up here. Mathematical truths are analytic in nature. Causal explanations are synthetic. So I'm going to try to remember that. The next time I see Danny, I'll say, are you familiar with that sort of language? Causal explanations are synthetic. Mathematical truths are analytic. I'm honestly, when I've studied math books, none of that language is used. No one says this is analytic. Mathematical truths are analytic.
One thing I found in my biostats class, Sal, is statisticians have about 4 different ways to refer to things, and they don't agree with each other on which terms to use. So I'd read something in my stats book and go, I don't understand that, so let me Google it. and see what and then I'd get 4 different explanations for it using 4 different sets of terms. And I'm like, that's not helpful, guys. That really isn't helpful at all.
Okay, so since we haven't had any questions, I'd like to thank the viewers for joining us. Can you just, it would just make me feel better. Can you tie this on how what we've done today relates to the Christian faith?
Sure. I think a lot of people who are not scientists, who are not in the giant nerd club that we inhabit, Sal, who just, they're regular people and they work a normal, 9-to-5 job. They've got their family and they take their kids to Little League practice and they're involved in their church. They don't have time, and B, they really don't have the inclination to dig into this stuff. And because of that, they feel like when a scientist gets up and talks, a lot of them feel intimidated. They feel like this person knows so much more than I do that I can't really challenge him. I might not agree with him, but I can't really argue with him because I don't know anything. And I think what we've talked about tonight, I think it's part of the reason we do this, is so that people do know some things. That's part of the reason. But part of it is too, like, to just bring this simple, bring this down to a level where everybody can get it. Because if you understand just a few basic concepts here, if you just, that the way natural selection is argued is illogical, then, you don't have anything to be afraid of from these people. Now, obviously, you didn't beforehand, right? But I understand feeling intimidated in a field that you're not experienced in. I totally get that. But, folks, God's word is true. And I don't care how many PhDs Professor X has. If what he says does not line up with the word, he's wrong, period. And the more you dig into the science and the more you dig into the nerd forum that Sal and I inhabit, the more you're going to realize that they're blowing smoke. A lot of smoke. So it looks like there's fire, but it's all smoke. They've got a giant smoke machine in the back room and they're blowing it out at you.
And sadly, these falsehoods have destroyed many souls. It's destroyed many souls. And thank God God made the world to testify of him. This can't go on forever without they can't suppress the truth forever. You can't.
Right.
And that was by design. God foresaw this, and he's equipped us. He's been very strong. And I was thinking that Emory and I were talking. He said, "There's so few of us in creation science. We're all spread so thin." And I said, "Yeah, that's just the way God works. That he deliberately thinned down the ranks of Gideon's army." He said, "I'm going to make it really clear this had nothing to do with you guys." So the reason creation science is moving forward is because of God's power, and it's evident in what he's made. It's not because of us,
Yes. Yes, that's 1,000% true. Because if you look around, like the number of people who are actually like dedicated creation scientists, who are like just actively working in the field, who aren't just like, oh yeah, I'm a scientist, I'm a creationist, but I work in something else. The people who are actually involved, like we're looking like less than 100 probably.
Yeah,
it's not many. And just being real, a lot of them are in their 60s or older, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to knock them for being old. That's not the point. The point is they're in the last third. They're in the last round for them. They don't have that much more time just by statistics. We need people coming up. We need people who are willing to get involved. And maybe you don't get into maybe you don't do it full time, but you work on it on the weekends or whatever. We need people to get involved and to keep the movement going. So if you're a science nerd,
oh, go on, Emory. I'm sorry.
If you're a science nerd and you've got maybe you're thinking about getting a degree, consider it. Think about it. I mean,
Yes.
obviously God may have something else for you. I'm not saying that's, what you have to do by any stretch, but think about it, because we need the support. We need people coming up. We need people to carry this thing forward. So anyway, go ahead, Sal.
Oh, thank you. And I wanted to say that's what this channel is organized for. And that's why I'm especially glad Emory, when he has a semester break, can spend time with me, because we do want to encourage the science students around the world. Because I know what it feels like to go into science class. And as I was saying yesterday, I realized, oh my goodness, we're reading the Bible, and then we go off to class and we're taught by people that are non-believers.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you think about what our lives are like to have to go through this, that the people that are going to teach us to proclaim God's creation are unbelievers.
Mm-hmm. I know. I've always found that deliciously ironic.
Yes. Emory, if you can stay after I end the stream,
Sure.
I have some stuff
Sure.
that I am eager to share with you privately.
Sure.
Just for the viewers, it is good news, but I don't want the good news to get out right now. And God bless you all. We may have a lot of Emory, I'm hoping, over the next 2 weeks during a semester break. So I'm going to beg him for some more time, because once the semester starts, I want to support him as a graduate student. We want him to be at the top of his class. Amen.
Lord willing, so far I'm hanging on. I'm halfway home, so we'll see if I can stay where I'm at. So,
all righty, take care, everyone, and may the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ be with all of you who have put your faith and trust in Him.
Amen.
God bless you.